They said the ocean forgets nothing, that every tide is a hand reaching backward through time, dragging secrets onto the shore. And if that's true, then the Driftwood House was never abandoned. It was waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to listen to what the water had been trying to say for nearly a century. Along a stretch of Atlantic coastline most maps barely bother to name, there stood a house made from the sea's leftovers. Warped planks, salt, bleached beams, timber scavenged from shipwrecks no one officially recorded. Locals called it the Driftwood House, not because it was quaint, but because it refused to stay buried. Storm after storm would strip sand away from its foundation, exposing it again, like a bone rising through shallow soil. To outsiders, it looked like a relic of coastal poverty. To the families who'd lived nearby for generations, it was something else entirely. A place you didn't point at, a place you didn't photograph, a place parents lowered their voices around, even when their children were grown. County records say it was built in 1921 by a man named Elias Crow, a carpenter returned from the Great War with a limp and a habit of waking up screaming. But the records stop there. No death certificate, no property transfer, no explanation for why the house never officially changed hands. It simply existed, year after year, storm after storm. The tides kept bringing things to its doorstep. A child's shoe in the 1930s, a waterlogged suitcase in the 1950s. In 1972, after a nor'easter tore the roof half away, a neighbor claimed he saw something nailed into the attic beams, something that looked like names, dozens of them, some crossed out, some carved so deeply they split the wood. What makes the Driftwood House unsettling isn't that something terrible happened there. It's that too many things did, and none of them stayed put. Stories shifted depending on who told them. Tragedies overlapped. Bloodlines tangled, and every generation insisted the truth had already washed out to sea. But the ocean doesn't erase, it returns, and what finally surfaced wasn't a body or a weapon. It was a memory, one that had been passed down like an heirloom no one wanted to claim. A family history soaked in salt water and silence. A truth that explains why the house still stands, and why some doors, once opened, never fully close again. Hello everyone, before we start make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching, that way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Long before the Driftwood House had a name, the land itself was already carrying weight. The shoreline shifted constantly, but the marsh behind it stayed the same, thick, brackish and quiet in a way that made even fishermen uneasy. Indigenous stories, recorded poorly and often mocked by early settlers, warned of places where water and memory tangled. Where grief didn't sink, it floated. When Elias Crow arrived in 1920, he didn't choose the land. It was given to him. A quiet thank you from a local councilman whose son had survived a transport ship torpedoed in the Atlantic. Elias had pulled him from the water, or so the story went. No official report ever confirmed it, but favors like that didn't need paperwork back then. They needed silence. Elias built the house with his own hands and with wood that shouldn't have held together as long as it did. Planks pried from wreckage after storms, beams from ships whose names were sanded away by salt, nails salvaged and straightened by firelight. Neighbors said he worked at night, lantern glowing like a fixed star. While the tide crept closer, he moved in alone. No wife, no children, no visitors who stayed long enough to be remembered. But he wrote letters, dozens of them, found years later in a locked drawer swollen shut by moisture. All addressed to the same surname Crow, but to different first names. Some were signed, some weren't. Many were never sent. The letters spoke in fragments. Apologies without crimes, gratitude without favors, and always the water. Elias wrote about the sound of it beneath the floorboards, even on calm nights, about dreams where the sea came inside the house, filling the rooms without breaking a single wall, about faces he recognized but couldn't place, staring up at him from below the surface. In 1927, the first disappearance was reported. A fisherman named Harold Pike failed to return from a routine run. His boat washed ashore 2 days later intact. No blood, no struggle. Just a single plank missing from the deck, later identified as driftwood, old, warped, and bearing the faint outline of carved letters. No charges were filed, no suspects named. But after that, people noticed patterns. Storms that ended at the Driftwood House. Lost items that reappeared on its porch. Children who swore they heard voices calling their names from inside when the windows were boarded shut. Elias Crow stopped being seen around town soon after. But the house didn't go quiet. Lights flickered. Smoke rose from the chimney. And every so often, after a hard tide, something new would be added to the structure, as if the ocean itself was helping him build or remember. By the time the 1930s arrived, Elias Crow had become less a man than a rumor. Children dared each other to knock on the Driftwood House and run. Adults crossed the road to avoid passing it. And yet, the house kept drawing people in, not with force, but with familiarity. as if something inside it already knew them. Census records from 1934 list Elias as deceased. No date, no cause, just a line through his name and the word presumed. But the house remained occupied. Mail continued to arrive. The porch light still burned on foggy nights, a dull amber glow that made sailors uneasy offshore. That was when the crows began to multiply. A woman named Margaret Crow appeared first. She claimed to be Elias's cousin, though no one could trace the connection. She moved into the house without ceremony, bringing only a trunk and a quiet child she never introduced by name. Margaret rarely spoke, but she listened, especially when the tide was high. Neighbors later said she stood barefoot at the water's edge for hours, as if waiting for instructions. More crows followed over the next 2 decades. Nieces, distant relations no one remembered being born. Each one arrived after a storm. Each one settled in without question, as though the house itself had sent for them. What no one understood at the time was that the Driftwood House wasn't just shelter. It was a ledger. In the attic, beneath warped boards and seabird nests, were carvings that grew year by year. Names, dates, lines connecting them like family trees drawn by an unsteady hand. Some names were scratched out so violently the wood splintered. Others were circled, underlined, marked with symbols no one recognized. When a local pastor was finally allowed inside in 1949, he described the air as heavy, not with rot but with presence. He said the house felt crowded, even though only Margaret and the child were there. He left after less than 10 minutes, later refusing to speak about what he'd seen. His journal entry from that day simply read, "They don't leave. They stay in the water, and the water brings them back." Deaths in the area rose quietly, not dramatically, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Accidents, drownings, people who walked into the marsh and were never found, always after storms, always followed by a new addition to the house, a beam, a wall, a repaired step made from unfamiliar wood. By the 1960s, locals stopped asking where the crows came from. The better question, the one no one wanted to voice, was where they went. The truth began to surface the way all buried things do, by accident. In 1968, a coastal survey commissioned by the state required inspectors to catalog every standing structure along the shore. The Driftwood House was marked as uninhabited, condemned. Scheduled for removal, no one bothered to inform the crows. When the inspectors arrived, they found the front door unlocked and the interior dry despite weeks of rain. Furniture sat arranged as if someone had just stepped out. Plates on the table, a kettle still smelling faintly of salt and iron, but no people. Not a single photograph, not a single mirror. Upstairs, one inspector pried open the attic hatch and climbed into a space that shouldn't have existed. The house was larger on the inside, longer, deeper, its beams layered in ways that ignored basic carpentry, and there etched into nearly every surface were names, hundreds of them now, some dating back before Elias Crow was even born. The inspector noticed something else. The names weren't random. They followed bloodlines, fathers to sons, sisters to nieces, entire branches ending abruptly, then reappearing decades later, spelled slightly differently, as if the house itself struggled to remember them correctly. Before the survey was completed, a storm rolled in without warning. The crew fled. When they returned days later, the Driftwood House was gone, not destroyed, not washed away, just absent. In its place was a stretch of clean sand, as though nothing had ever stood there. No debris, no foundation. The state quietly closed the file. But the house didn't disappear for good. It resurfaced 3 miles north after a hurricane in 1984, half buried but intact. Same layout, same carvings, same quiet pull. A new family moved in before authorities could respond, using the surname Crow. This time, someone started asking questions. A graduate student researching coastal folklore noticed the repeating names across obituaries, shipping manifests, and church records. The same families, always tied to storms, always near water, and always eventually linked back to a structure made from the sea's dead remains. What she uncovered was a pattern of substitution. When someone was lost, another took their place. Same blood, same name. As if the ocean demanded balance and the Driftwood House kept the books. The final note in her research journal was dated 2 weeks before she vanished during a solo shoreline walk. It read, "The house isn't haunted, it's inherited, and I think it's my turn to remember." By the time the house returned in the late 1980s, the shoreline had changed, but the pattern hadn't. The crows who moved in that year were quieter than the others, kept the windows shuttered, paid cash, enrolled their children in local schools under names that had already appeared on headstones nearby. Teachers noticed the kids knew things they shouldn't, old hymns no longer sung, family trees that bent backward instead of forward. One boy, barely 10, wrote an essay about his great-great-grandfather Elias as if he'd met him, described the limp, the screaming dreams, the way the sea spoke at night. When the teacher asked where he'd learned that, the boy said, "The house remembers for us, That was when locals began to understand the rule that had governed the Driftwood House from the beginning. The Crows didn't own it. They inherited the obligation. Every generation lost someone to the water, not violently, not dramatically, just gone, and in return the house stayed standing. The remaining family stayed intact, names continued, bloodlines remained unbroken, a quiet transaction repeated often enough that it started to feel normal. What made it unbearable was the choice. Letters found later, hidden behind walls and beneath floorboards, revealed that the Crows knew. At least some of them did. They wrote about bargaining, about delaying storms, about choosing who would walk into memory so the rest could stay. Some letters begged forgiveness from future children. Others spoke with cold certainty, framing loss as duty. One note, written in a careful hand, "The ocean doesn't want us all, just enough to remember we belong to it." When the last known Crow family left the Driftwood House in 2003, they didn't disappear. They simply changed names, moved inland, broke the pattern. And for the first time in 80 years, the house stood empty through an entire storm season. It didn't last. After the fourth unbalanced tide, the house began to decay faster than physics allowed. Beams split, carvings blood dark with moisture, names blurred. As if without blood to anchor it, the memory was dissolving. That's when a distant cousin, one who'd never met the others, received a deed in the mail. No return address, just a key wrapped in salt-stained paper, and a single sentence written in the margin. "You don't remember yet, but you will. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline?" The cousin arrived in winter, when the coast feels abandoned even by God. He told himself he was there to sell the land, to settle a strange clerical error left by relatives he'd never known. But the moment he stepped inside the Driftwood House, the lie collapsed. The air carried recognition, not comfort recognition, like hearing your name spoken by someone you can't see. He found the carvings first, names he didn't recognize and some he did. His own surname appeared more than once, in different hands, at different depths. One version shallow and tentative, another cut so deep the wood had split and been repaired around it. Time layered like sediment. At night, the house made its case. The sound wasn't voices, not exactly. It was memory without language. Images pressed behind his eyes when he tried to sleep, storms he'd never lived through, hands he'd never held, funerals he'd never attended yet somehow mourned. He began to understand what the others had meant. The house didn't invent stories, it stored them. County archives later revealed he wasn't the first Crow to try walking away. Others had fled inland, changed names, raised children who never learned the truth. And every time, the pattern corrected itself. Floods in places that had never flooded. Accidents that didn't make sense. Loss that felt targeted, not random. The ocean, it seemed, had a long reach. The cousin stayed 3 weeks. Long enough to find the letters. Long enough to read the arguments written between generations, some pleading to end it, others insisting that forgetting was the real death. One passage, repeated across decades, stood out like a refrain. "If no one remembers, we all drown." When he left, the house did not follow. It didn't need to. 2 months later, a storm tore through a town 50 miles inland, collapsing a structure that had stood for 100 years. A name was added to a piece of driftwood that washed up miles away. The Driftwood House still appears on the shoreline after major storms. Condemned, unlisted, waiting, not for victims but for heirs. Because some histories don't end when you abandon them. They wait until someone remembers enough to finish the story. The official record ends the way most uncomfortable histories do, with a shrug. The Driftwood House is listed as non-existent in current coastal surveys. Satellite images blur where it should be. Deeds loop back on themselves. And yet, after every major storm, someone posts a photograph online that disappears within hours. A crooked porch, a salt-stained door, a house that looks assembled from other people's endings. What the archive doesn't say, but what the carvings make clear, is that the Driftwood House was never about punishment. It was about continuity. About the terror of a family realizing they mattered enough to be remembered by something older than the nation built around them. America is full of houses like this, structures tied to land that was taken, water that was altered, lives that were quietly balanced against progress. We like our haunted stories, clean ghosts, curses, endings. But the Driftwood House offers something worse, responsibility. Because nothing forced the Crows to keep going, they chose to, again and again. Each generation deciding that survival was worth the cost, that memory, no matter how heavy, was better than erasure. And maybe that's why the house never collapsed. It wasn't fed by death. It was fed by acknowledgement. There are rumors now of new names appearing, not carved by hand, but etched by water, pressure, and time. Surnames that don't belong to the Crows at all. Families who move near the coast for peace, for cheap land, for the view. Families who don't yet know what they've stepped into, because the tide doesn't care about lineage, only balance. If the Driftwood House has a lesson, it's this: the past doesn't stay buried just because we stop looking for it. It waits, it drifts, and when the conditions are right, it builds itself a doorway. Some of you listening will feel an unease you can't explain, a sense that this story brushed against something personal. That's not fear, that's recognition. Every family has a house like this somewhere in its history, maybe not by the ocean, maybe not made of driftwood, but built from choices no one wanted to claim. The difference is that most of them collapsed. This one didn't.